Assalamu alaikum. Hello and welcome to the Community Policy Forum podcast during Islamophobia Awareness Month. My name is Zahid Ali and I'm one of the directors of CPF. For those who are new to the work of the Community Policy Forum, we are an independent think tank seeking to promote evidence-based and community-centered approaches to policy making on the structural inequalities facing Muslim communities in the UK. And we attempt to do this through connecting policymakers with academic research and experts, and through providing platforms for engagement with diverse Muslim voices on areas of contemporary importance. Now, this is Islamophobia Awareness Month, as you might be aware, and the theme this year is tackling denial. And what we're going to discuss today is understanding intersectional experiences of Islamophobia. Muslims, as you know, are a very diverse community, and we all have unique experiences of Islamophobia, depending upon many numerous factors. And inshallah, I hope we are able to talk about these things. So first of all, let me introduce our guest. Mahrukh Adnan Shaukat has been a development officer at Amina Muslim Women's Resource Centre for 6 years. She's currently working on improving the levels of understanding around inequalities and inclusion practice across all sectors, especially in regard to gender, race and religion, and creating campaigns for visual and literal representation of a diverse range of Muslim women's voices. Our next guest is Michael Dhanoya, is a doctoral candidate in the School of Criminology at the University of Leicester. His research focuses on Shiaphobia as a form of religious hate crime, a subject he is well versed in due to his volunteering role in various victim support agencies. And our next guest is Huda Osman, and has a background in criminology as well, and has been working for the Islamophobia Response Unit since 2018. She's a senior caseworker with a focus on hate crime cases. The IRU is a registered charity established in 2017 in response to the rise in Islamophobic attacks. The IRU provides free legal guidance and referral services to victims of Islamophobia and hate crime and discrimination. Okay, so that's the introductions out of the way. Sister Mahrukh, I'll start with asking you, through your work at Amina, how have you come to understand the ways in which being a Muslim woman can impact one's experiences of Islamophobia?
So through my work, we at the helpline hear from women who are in lots of different stages of life. And I think the main thing that I probably learned around Islamophobia is how to better understand it as a context to which everything else in people's lives is happening. So Islamophobia, I would say, is not something that happens as like a random crime on a street or something that might happen here and there. It's something that women experience and feel and internalize, and then it comes out all the time. And for people, it's kind of like something that's almost expected. It's something that will inhibit a person from taking certain actions, maybe getting involved in their children's school, or taking a particular bus route, or fighting too hard for something around their benefits if their benefits are late or something like that. Just, it's something which is inhibiting people from acting too much, quote unquote. And I see it as something which is worryingly always public, and the fact that it's so public gives a little bit more emphasis, I suppose, to what I'm saying. It's the fact that it's just a context, a generic context that's now in the UK. And it's, when people do feel it, the number one thing that they say that they want and they never get is not necessarily its criminalization or any kind of influence from the police or anything like that, but it's just for someone to say that, are you okay? Did something happen? Like, I saw that didn't feel right. I didn't like watching that. None of that ever happens. People kind of just hold back and are like, oh, I suppose that's just, if you're going to wear that, that's just something that happens to you, like for a visibly Muslim woman, for example, or that's just kind of a nasty thing, but I'm not going to go see if that person's okay. So it's not necessarily always approved of. I wouldn't say that of everyone in the population, but it's certainly not something that's seen as really bad and something that should be stopped either. It's just like an uncomfortable truth, it seems, for most people.
And of course, as a Muslim man, I'm less likely to have to suffer from Islamophobia rather than a woman would be. especially a woman who's wearing hijab?
Yeah, I don't know whether it's more or less likely. This is something that I'm not quite sure. I mean, I know that in the stats, I'm sure that Sister Huda can speak to that more, having worked in that. But from all the stats, it does show that visibly Muslim women are reporting it a lot more, and they do experience a lot more. And I think that whenever a visibly Muslim woman has reported it, it has always been public as well. But I don't know what the experiences of Muslim men are, what those have looked like in their day-to-day lives, if it's something that's brushed off or something that's normal, or if it's so tied in with racism as well that people don't even notice the difference anymore, whatever it is. I'm not sure. Actually, that would be a really good question to ask the other panelists, I think.
Absolutely. Sister Huda, I mean, your input would be valuable here.
Yeah, just in terms of just statistics, like you both have said it, there is statistics to prove that Muslim women are subjected to Islamophobia at a much higher level. However, one thing that we have seen is that, and this is just a recent reflection that we were making, when, for example, a sister isn't visibly Muslim, so she isn't visibly wearing anything which would identify as being Muslim, we have seen a difference in the type of Islamophobia she's subjected to. So, for example, a client that I was speaking to recently, she was subjected to discrimination by one of her directors for the estate that she lives in, and he was deliberately mispronouncing her name, even though she's corrected him a few times, and that led to like a culture between the senior members at a management team to start singling her out in comparison to everyone else, just on the basis of her name. So yeah, like you said, there is a difference, but having said that, we see that a lot of times Muslim women are subjected to physical abuse or verbal abuse, so more Islamophobia in the public, whereas Muslim men are subjected to Islamophobia, but within like their workplaces or education, for example. So that is something else that we've been trying to notice, been keeping our eye out on.
So Sister Mahrukh, I mean, what about women who look physically different? I mean, wear the jilbab or the hijab.
Yeah.
I mean, is it more likely that they're going to suffer?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen it time and time again, especially with the continuous debate about Muslim women and their dress codes. Like we saw when Boris Johnson had described Muslim women who wear the niqab as letterboxes. We were all made very aware of the drastic increase in attacks against Muslim women, and we've seen that even in our cases. We had a sister who was, I believe it was in Halifax, this incident, and she was just stood in the post office, and some guy, just a random guy, thought it would be funny to come and try and shove a post letter through basically the gaps of her niqab, and you understand what he's trying to insinuate. So yeah, there is no doubt about it, the fact that Muslim women who are visibly Muslim would be subjected to more Islamophobia. And it is quite concerning because I think just between sisters, a lot of times we've had family members who have come to us and advised us, do you think that wearing hijab is a good idea? Do you think wearing a niqab is a good idea? So it's like you have to not lower your expectation, or you have to sort of not express your Muslimness. I think that might be a better way of phrasing it, so that you are now safer. And it is quite sad because that's the pressure that a lot of Muslim girls now are going through. And some of the work that I do with even Muslim youth, they've expressed that sometimes they feel that there's a constant battle between them wanting to be Muslim but be British as well. And there's a whole like sort of, it's like what was it called? It's like a conflict of identities that they're currently experiencing, because it's that they don't want to not wear the hijab, for example, but they know that if they do, what type of treatment they may be subjected to. So even, for example, right now with schools and this whole debate about students not being allowed to wear abaya in school, and if they don't want to wear, if they accept that they're not willing to wear abaya, are schools then allowing them to wear like long skirts to accommodate to the child's wants, really. And yeah, so there is a lot going on when it comes to Muslim women and dress codes of all ages. It's not subjected to just women on the street, it's now also in education, which is up and coming a really big issue that I would say we need to monitor.
Okay, and if we add another layer to that, I mean, for example, Black Muslim women, I mean, then there's the racism, there's Islamophobia, they're women. I mean, it's just a triple layer there. I mean, so what have your experiences been in the IRU with that?
Yeah, so there is the term triple penalty. That's the one that oftentimes we use when we're discussing this topic. And it's the fact that Muslim women are women of BME background, and they're women and being Muslim. So there's that 3-layer of discrimination that they're being subjected to. And likewise, in our statistics, we have seen Black Muslims. We've got quite a few reports of Black Muslims. I think when we last counted, it was about 102 reports, which is quite a small figure in comparison to all our reports. So it is definitely not representative of the entire situation and Islamophobia against Black Muslims. But what I can say is, yeah, there's no denying about the fact that Black Muslims are being subjected to more discrimination in comparison to their just Black African counterparts. And we've seen this even when I was reading some statistics before joining the call. I believe it was Muslim Census, they released an article just in November, and it explained that Black African Muslim households were 56% more in poverty in comparison to just Black Africans. And just a case study that I thought I'd mention on this topic, it was actually regarding a sister, and it is to do with the hijab, which we were referring to a bit earlier. And she recently had decided to start wearing the hijab, but when she was just at a car park, and it was just Sainsbury's car park, which is just so normal, and the guy proceeded to tell her, just give me a second to remember the actual phrase. Oh yeah, he told us to go back to her country, and he was referring to, and then he insulted her for wearing her hijab. So it's that double layer that Muslims are going through. And funnily enough, with this man, when she then confronted him, she felt she was okay enough to confront him, and she said, I'm going to call the police because that's not I'm not going to tolerate your treatment. He then responded to her and told her that, look, so what if you tell the police they're not going to do anything? So it really ties in with this whole topic of tackling denial. And alhamdulillah, the outcome for this case was, funnily enough, all she had taken a photo of was the reflection of him through his own car, and the police were able to locate the suspect and he was charged. Alhamdulillah. So that did end successfully. So yeah. Do Black Muslims have slightly more protection because of the Race Relations Act? So when it comes to charging just Islamophobia in general, so it's more so the police who would separate it. So of course, when the police, when they're like doing their tagging system, I think it's called the CRIS system. When they're actually taking down a report, then they'll flag it with different codes. So if it was like homophobia, then they'll flag it with that. The Islamophobia, they'll flag it with that. But when it actually comes to legislation, what they would crime it under is race and religious. So it's that they recognize that it's both, and the legislation would basically recognize it as being one crime, if that makes sense, as opposed to separating it out as Islamophobia and racial. So that clarifies.
Okay, that's interesting. So, I mean, in terms of Muslim community themselves, is there more awareness in the Muslim community now about the experiences of Black Muslims?
Yes, that's something else I was unsure whether to touch upon. And oftentimes because just to explain, I am Black, I recognize as being Black African, but I am Eritrean. So I would recognize that people of, for example, East African background experience a different level of racism in comparison to people from more maybe West Africa. So there is a lot of research that shows the difference between the experiences amongst Africans depending on where they are part of Africa. So for example, North Africa, East Africa, and West Africa. And there is a lot of research that shows that, when it comes to the Muslim community, there is I don't know if to call it inter-racism, but there is racism between Muslims within the community, specifically towards Black Africans, and I would say more so towards Black West Africans. And it is very unfortunate, but I think now with the BLM movement, there's been a lot of recognition and a lot of research poured into the Muslim community about trying to tackle this issue of racism within the Muslim community itself.
I was surprised to hear you say that there's a difference between Muslims from East Africa and West Africa. Is there a reason for that? Because
I would say that when it comes to West Africa, oftentimes it appears that with, for example, their cultural practices, there's this notion that a lot of their cultural practices isn't in line with Islam. Whereas with East Africa, we still have, for example, Sudan, which is an Arab-speaking country. Even in Eritrea, like the second language that's spoken is still Arabic. So there's a lot of quote-unquote Muslimness within our countries, and that's why it's more Yeah, but
Yes,
that's why
yes.
it hasn't been like we're not subjected to the same Islamophobia to them. Like, when we feel that, I'll say, even if, for example, the fact that I can speak the language, Arabic language, I can feel more involved when I go to massages, for example, as opposed to West Africans. And there's a lot of case studies where Black Muslims have gone to massages and they've been excluded.
Yeah.
And even if we look at London, like how many massages are actually Black led and have Black members in their boards? Do you see? Whereas with us, for example, I've got a few just from the top of my head which are East African led, and that's why I would think that does also contribute.
I mean, I noticed that MCB and MEND have recently had campaigns on this topic, so hopefully there is greater awareness within the Muslim community as well. Moving on, Michael, I wanted to bring you in and ask you, in the light of your own research, there are particular types of hatred which you feel Shia Muslim communities are affected by, and do such types of hatred transcend everyday experiences of Islamophobia?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. So from my own research, I can say that there is evidence to suggest that Shia Muslim communities in this country suffer from not only Islamophobia, but also Shiaphobia as well. And for the purposes of this panel, I will describe Shiaphobia very loosely as hate crime perpetrated by non-Shia Muslims against Shia Muslims, specifically because they are Shia. So they're targeting them for their Shia identity. So this means that along with having to take on the burden of Islamophobia, there's this extra form of religiously motivated hate, which they suffer concurrently at the same time to the same level of degree. And there are plenty of instances this year alone where there have been specific occasions which have triggered Shiaphobia online and offline. I'll give you a very quick example. The 16th to the 17th of July saw the Shia celebration of Eid al-Khadir, which is the occasion Shia Muslims believe the Prophet Muhammad elected Ali ibn Abi Talib as his political successor. Now, this is a religious celebration celebrated by Shia Muslims, but not Sunni Muslims. And this triggered online and offline Shiaphobia. And I just want to touch upon the way that this became manifest, because it speaks to the conversation we've been having previously about intersectionality of identities. So this occasion obviously saw references and alluded to the theological differences between Sunni and Shia. So especially in terms of the language that was used during or amid the Eid al-Khadir celebrations, you know, the Shia were referred to as kuffar, disbelievers, murtadun, apostates, zanadika, heretics, Ahl al-Bidah, the people of innovation. But specifically as well, we're seeing what I would say is the intersectionality of identity coming to the fore here and really being highlighted in the Shiaphobia that was suffered. So if I give you the example of Shia Muslim women, for example, they suffered a lot of what I would say is explicitly misogynistic and sexist language, which is so explicit that I don't feel comfortable saying on this forum. But they also suffered, in terms of physical abuse, that abuse which would still be considered misogynistic and sexist physical abuse. And I think these types of instances could be referenced as falling under the umbrella term of unwanted sexual advances. So, and they suffered these instances along with being referred to by those theological terms, you know, kuffar, zanadika at the same time. So it speaks to what we've said before, where as a Shia woman, you're going to be abused because you're a Shia, but you're also going to be abused because you're a woman. And this happens both online and offline. We spoke recently as well just about the issue of race. And again, we found, especially online on social media platforms, where racism, again, too explicit to mention, but racism was also intermingled with generic Shiaphobic terminology to show how someone could be a Shia and could be of a different race, and these two things could intersect. So two elements of your identity could intersect and become manifest as forms of Shiaphobia.
Do you find that there are trends to this? For example, events, political climate, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so I was looking at the literature on this for Islamophobia as well, and I just wanted to compare and contrast. And I think if you look at Islamophobia in general, there's the notion that there's the everyday Islamophobia, so things that can happen all the time. And then there are certain trigger events that can cause there to be a surge or a spike in Shiaphobia. Things such as the acts committed by ISIS or the 2015 Paris shootings, for example. So you would say terrorist events committed by those who self-identify as Muslim cause surge in Islamophobia. So you see that pattern there of the everyday undercurrent and then the spikes. And I think a similar instance or a similar pattern is evident in Shiaphobia. I think there are definitely certain instances which trigger a surge in Shiaphobia. One of the things that I've just alluded to would be those religious celebrations that are celebrated by Shia Muslims, but not necessarily by non-Shia Muslims. Eid al-Khadir, Ashura, Muharram, those kind of things. But I also think geopolitical tensions also really exacerbate this issue as well. So the conflict that is still ongoing, unfortunately, in Syria, and the news that comes out of the Syrian civil war, acts committed by ISIS against Shia communities, geopolitical events in either Saudi Arabia, a Sunni Muslim country, if you like, and Iran, a Shia Muslim country. These sorts of things would instigate a spike in Shiaphobia. But there's also the everyday, not the hidden, but the more subtle forms of Shiaphobia. For example, asking about someone's name, saying that's a unique Islamic name, for example, those types of things. So I think there's a clear pattern there of Shiaphobia that suffered in the United Kingdom.
Okay, and do you think there's enough awareness about this in the Muslim community in general, or how can we raise more awareness of this?
Yeah, I think in general, I've been thinking about this, and I think one of the issues is that just in public and political spaces, there's no real awareness about this at all. So I'll give you an example of something that I think needs to be done. If you were to look at the hate crime statistics for England and Wales from 2021 to 2022, you'll see that the religiously motivated hate that you see covers hate crime perpetrated against Muslims in general and other religious groups. But this gives rise to the fact that, or gives rise to the notion that the only sort of religiously motivated hate that a Muslim could suffer is Islamophobia. And there's no notion of intra-Islamic religiously motivated hate. And I think this is something that is reflected in Muslim communities in general. There doesn't seem to be a willingness to open up and say that within our own communities that there is an issue of intra-Islamic hate crime. And I just wanted to pick up on something that Huda just said previously in terms of the recording system that the police utilize when they're recording incidents of hate crime. When they're looking at hate perpetrated against Muslims, they just tick it off as Islamophobia, for example. And I was just thinking, perhaps it's worth adding an extra category of religiously motivated hate, where they could demarcate between religiously motivated hate in general and more specific sectarian hatred. And I think if they were to do that, it would allow things like Islamophobia and Shiaphobia to be distinguished in, between one another. And I think therefore, at least in official hate crime statistics moving forward, that would prevent Shiaphobia from being hidden in political space. And I think if it was to come out in political spaces, then it will come out in the public space of Islamic communities. Because at the moment, I think in both spaces, it's an invisible phenomenon.
Yeah, can I just come in on that as well? Like in Scotland, we obviously have a lot of work around sectarianism because of Celtic Rangers matches and Protestant Catholic movements and all of the links that we have with people who immigrated from Ireland. And although there's such a lot of focus on anti-sectarianism, and none of the anti-sectarianism laws did they actually look at the sectarianism that can exist in other religious spaces. So we have brought that up because there have been cases of sectarian violence amongst Muslims in Scotland as well, and we did raise that with the police as well, and it's just not something that's been picked up on, not by people who are anti-sectarianism activists or by the police or by anybody else. And so we do really need to continue to push that forward. I mean, in a place like Scotland, where it's already so looked at, but it's so invisible, Shia Muslims are so invisible here as well. I think that's a massive problem.
Thinking about Islamophobia in general during Islamophobia Awareness Month, in terms of Muslims are a very diverse community. We come from all sorts of different backgrounds and educational backgrounds, or in terms of how much we practice, and of course all the cultural aspects to it. Do you think that communities are being more fractured because of the differences that we're getting as our young people are getting older and taking different experiences in life? Are they experiencing Islamophobia in different ways, depending upon how religious they are, what kind of background they're coming from? Anyone can pick up on that?
I think one of the things that we're seeing, which is a slightly like roundabout way of answering your question, but one of the things that we're seeing is that with everyone's general awareness of Islamophobia, regardless of how they're experiencing it, one of the things which is worrying to me as a caseworker who works specifically with women from different backgrounds and Muslim women, is that because of how people perceive outside the Muslim community, how they perceive the Muslim community members are then more and more worried about how actions within the community or things that happen within the community then reflect on them outside, and the backlash that can have. One of the ways that this is manifested is that people are often are silenced or told not to speak about or report abuses that happen to them. So I would say that as young people are growing up in the community, even if they aren't necessarily as culturally tied in whatever way their family might have before, or religiously tied in whatever way their family might have before, if they know that they're Muslim or they identify as Muslim or are identified as Muslim and experience Islamophobia, then that is something that can still affect them regardless. The idea that, okay, what I do then reflects my community and other people expect me to live within certain limits or not report X, Y, and Z things that have happened to me. And I think that's something that isn't spoken about enough when we're discussing Islamophobia. It's not necessarily the community's fault. It's not something I'm blaming, but it is something the community does need to address, because it is something that is coming within us in reaction to something that's happened to us, our communities.
So, I mean, the theme of this year's Islamophobia Awareness Month is, tackling the denial in general. How do you feel that we as Muslims are tackling this issue in general? I mean, we have Islamophobia Awareness Month every year. We raise the profile, and yet, for example, the Conservative Party is still not accepting the definition of Islamophobia. So how do you feel that as a community, are we making any inroads year on year, or are we kind of standing still?
I don't mind making a comment on that. I think, no doubt, in terms of just looking at the movement in terms of tackling Islamophobia, it's been going well for a few years. It was just really, I think, Hazem may know the date, but I think it was only like 2016, if I'm not mistaken, that the police actually started logging Islamophobia as a hate crime in of itself. And now, thankfully, for the majority of police forces in the UK, they will recognise Islamophobia as basically a separate hate crime. Yes, there's a lot that still needs to be done with police forces, because time and time again, we've spoken to so many victims who have said that, they've gone to the police with their report, and either one, the police have failed to actually acknowledge that they've been a victim themselves, and so they're quick to dismiss them, or two, they may actually mislog their report as a race incident as opposed to Islamophobia, which then hinders the stats, because we've seen, with even the recent Home Office stats, racism has, I think it was like 70,000 incident reports, whereas religious hate crime is significantly lower. but yet the reports in year on year out have not seen that much of a difference. So it's about whether the police are actually logging it correctly. And we've had instances where they have logged it as a racist incident, excuse me, but then we've then gone back to speak to a police officer, clarified that it's not, the victim hasn't recognized it as a racist incident, it's actually hate crime. So I think year on, especially with the movements of I Am and the work that Men's doing, it is having a good impact in terms of tackling Islamophobia, because it is, one, the awareness that the Muslim community requires, and two, we're now engaging in spaces that the Muslim community weren't able to engage with before, i.e. politics. And even, for example, is the Get Out and Vote campaign, getting Muslims to actually vote, ensure that their voices are being heard. They're having, I forgot the name of those sessions, which is really poor of me, but, you know, actually engaging with members of parliament who they want to elect, having those like assemblies with them to question them, what are you actually going to do about Islamophobia? Yeah, the Get Out and Vote campaign. But doing these sort of campaigns, it really does support the Muslim community, because for a long time, it wasn't that we were participating in these circles, and that's why oftentimes our voices were not heard. But likewise, even with the fact that now there's, even with the fact that now a lot of Muslims are coming to the IRU, which thankfully does actually support the victims, and it gives them the opportunity to get that legal support from the outset, so that, you know, if they feel that they're not being heard by the police, they can then come to us and we'd help them literally from the start of their report till the end, and then trying to help them post it as well. So yeah, I think for now, alhamdulillah, I think we are moving at a good pace.
So, you know, as Muslims, younger Muslims especially, you know, broaden out into society and face new challenges, but there's still that denial of Islamophobia within the Muslim community and outside the Muslim community. Just your feeling on, I know you've already mentioned that we're making progress in terms of the police reports and all the rest of it, but what's the way forward in society as we, you know, go into another year?
I would say definitely in terms of just engaging in the public spaces, but also, political spaces, but also is that with Muslims, we need to understand that there are legislations out there to support us. Yes, it is very difficult. So for example, you know, a lot of times Muslims are potentially the first employee to request things like prayer spaces, be the employee, you know, maybe they're the only Muslim employee who practices Ramadan. So oftentimes there will be that minority, but it is quite hard, especially when you're on that basis, but it's to not fear to express your Muslimness. And if you do have that backlash, it's to understand there are processes in place which should protect you and enable you to practice your religion freely within this country. And there are services out there as well to support you. So for example, with the IRU, we don't only deal with hate crime, we have a discrimination branch as well. So it's not, we don't recognize that Islamophobia only takes place on the streets. It happens at education level, institutional level. It happens when you're at work. People like for example, I was speaking to one of my previous clients just a few days ago, and she used to work, she was an optometrist, and she used to work for a company. She was the only hijabi for years at this optometrist. And she noticed straight away that she was being questioned time and time again about her decisions to wear hijab, the decisions to even fast. And she was subjected to a lot of harassment by her colleagues. But she wasn't willing to tolerate it. And one of the reasons why is that she said that she doesn't want this to become a hostile environment for other Muslims who want to come to this workplace in the future. So her taking a stand helped prevent that, and also take action against the people perpetrating it as well. So it's one thing that I would definitely say to Muslims who are being subject to Islamophobia is that understand that there are actual laws there in this country to protect you, and there are services that are willing to support you as well. It's just even if you feel unsure whether you even want to take action at the moment, is to contact like the different services available and speak to them about your situation, and they will advise you. And of course, it doesn't mean that means you have to report it. It's just to understand what options are available for you.
Mahrukh, I mean, I came across this thing in Scotland where in the last census, the number of people who identified as Muslims was less than previous years, even though we know there's an increase in Muslims. And it suggested that Muslims, young Muslims, don't want to identify as Muslims anymore. for various reasons, and a lot of that is to do with Islamophobia, and they don't want to be associated with that. Have you had any, working amongst Muslim women, have you had any experiences like that where people don't want to be identified as Muslims?
I think one of the things that a lot of Muslim women have spoken to us about is around parenting. I mean, it is a separate thing on our helpline that we categorize some of our calls under, because there is a divide often that we hear about that between Muslim parents and their children, and what their children's ideas of Islam and being Muslim are in this country. And it can be something that some children want to step away from, or some people don't want to be as public about, or unnecessarily identify with, or have something as something that they have to deal with. I can't comment on necessarily the numbers and things. I haven't seen the statistics or that report yet myself, but yeah, it is going to be probably a recurring problem for a lot of people who live in this country, where their children are having identity crises and need some support going through that, and sometimes their children will want to step away. And again, I suppose as a community, if one of the things we need to do in tackling the denial of Islamophobia is to recognize how difficult it is for young people to grow up as Muslim in this country, and to be able to find ways to support them so that they can make choices that reflect and honor who they want to be, and make that easier for them as well, in whichever way they choose.
Thank you. In terms of the Shia community in particular, is there anything they would like? What do they want for the broader community, especially the Sunni Muslim community? What they're looking from them to try and understand the kind of experiences that they've been having?
Yeah, so one thing that I've noticed in particular is, especially with Sunni Shia dialogues within the community, there's a lot of workshops and conversations where it's an evening session where you can come to learn about one another's differences as different Islamic groups, and there's always a conversation at the end of how we should be united. But what I've noticed is there's not a lot of conversation of how we can actually go about being united. What do we actually do? Because it's always nice to say we should be, but then what are the practical steps? And one thing that I've noticed from Shia communities in general, working as a volunteer for various victim support agencies, is that Shia Muslims say, well, you only cater to victims of Islamophobia, you don't cater to Shia phobia. And the victim support agencies that I work for say, oh, no, within Islamophobia, we do mean Shia phobia as well. We're tackling all forms of Islamic religiously motivated hate. So I think what they would want specifically from victim support agencies is just be a bit more explicit. If you mean to tackle all forms of Islamophobic hate, including that the intra-Islamic hate crime as well, allow us to feel like there's a platform, there's somewhere we can go to voice our experiences. So I think that was a bit of a roundabout way of answering your questions, but just more practical guidelines between different religious Islamic communities in the actual communities themselves. How do we go forward to bring about unity? And also any victim support agencies, just be a bit more clear that you do support all victims of religiously motivated hate, not just victims of Islamophobia.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, I noticed that, for example, in Edinburgh, we have a lot of interaction between the Muslim and Sunni community, especially at the university levels. There's lots of talks and stuff, but you said they need to do practical things, and you mentioned a few there, so thank you for that. Anyway, thank you everybody for joining us for this discussion and during Islamophobia Awareness Month. Thank you for giving us your time. Just to let you know, if you want to follow the work that Community Policy Forum do, you can check out our website, communitypolicyforum.com, and you can follow us on Twitter at Policy Community. Thank you, and have a good day. Assalamu alaikum.
Thanks, Adnan.